4 seconds. 4 seconds of drumming is worth $100 million, but only if you're not the one who created it. In recording studios from Los Angeles to New York, from London to Tokyo, music producers have been mining the same golden vein for over 3 decades. They load up their samplers, scroll through their libraries, and stop at the same place, Funky Drummer by James Brown. That hypnotic break, the one that makes your head nod involuntarily, that sits perfectly under any beat, that defines the sound of hip-hop itself, has been sampled more than any other recording in music history. Dr. Dre built Death Row Records on it. Public Enemy created sonic revolution with it. Countless platinum albums, sold-out tours, and billion-dollar careers were constructed on that 4-second foundation. But the man who gave the world that gift spent his 70s sitting in lawyers' offices, trying to explain to judges why his genius deserved compensation. James Brown didn't just influence hip-hop. He provided its DNA, its backbone, its soul. And in return, he got a bill for legal fees and a lesson in how America treats its black innovators, with applause in public and theft in private. Before we dive deeper into this story, please subscribe to support content that reveals the untold histories of music legends. November 1969. Cincinnati Recording Studio. James Brown stood in the control booth, eyes locked on drummer Clyde Stubblefield. "Just give me the beat," James said. "Nothing fancy. Just the one." Clyde nodded and began to play. What emerged over the next 4 seconds would become the most sampled rhythm in music history, though nobody in that room knew it yet. The pattern was deceptively simple, a syncopated groove that emphasized the downbeat in a way that made your body respond before your brain could process it. Boom. Bap boom boom bap. It wasn't just a drum break. It was a conversation between rhythm and soul, a mathematical equation that somehow captured the entirety of Black American musical innovation in a handful of notes. "That's it," James said. The track was released, buried in an album, unnoticed. In 1969, nobody paid particular attention to Funky Drummer. It wasn't a hit single. It didn't tear up the charts. It simply faded into the background of American music like so many other brilliant moments that the mainstream wasn't ready to appreciate. But time has a way of revealing genius that the present overlooks. 20 years later, in a Bronx apartment, a young producer named Marley Marl was digging through crates of old records, searching for sounds to sample. Hip-hop producers needed breaks, perfect rhythms to build on. Marley Marl pulled out a dusty James Brown album, dropped the needle, and heard those 4 seconds. His head started nodding before he even realized it was happening. That was the test. If a break could make you move involuntarily, if it could bypass your conscious mind and speak directly to your body, then it was golden. He loaded the break into his SP1200 sampler, looped it, and felt the room change. This wasn't just a good drum break. This was the drum break. Word spread fast. Producers everywhere sought that break. Public Enemy, Dr. Dre, LL Cool J all built hits on it. The list grew longer every year, thousands of tracks, spanning every subgenre of hip-hop and bleeding into pop, rock, and electronic music. By the mid-90s, that 4-second drum break had appeared in more recordings than any other sample in history. But here's what nobody was asking in the rush to build new empires on old sounds: where was James Brown's cut? James Brown first became aware of sampling in the mid-80s, when his manager brought him a rap album and pointed out 3 different tracks using his horns, his drums, his grunts. At first, James was flattered. Young black artists building on his work felt like legacy. Then his lawyers showed him the truth. Because what James discovered was that none of these artists had asked permission. None of them had paid licensing fees. None of them had sent royalty checks. They'd simply taken pieces of his life's work, looped them, and built platinum-selling careers without ever acknowledging the source. The culture saw sampling as homage. The law saw it as theft. James Brown was caught in the middle. His legal team began documenting every sample, every unauthorized use of his recordings. What they discovered was staggering in its scope. By the early 90s, James Brown's music had been sampled in over 7,000 different tracks. 7,000 separate instances of artists taking his sound and making it their own. His lawyers calculated the potential value of these samples based on standard licensing fees, and the number they arrived at was almost impossible to believe: $100 million. $100 million in unpaid royalties, representing decades of music that had been built on James Brown's foundation without compensating him for the building materials. His entire net worth was $15 million. The samples were worth 7 times that, going to others. The lawsuit started in 1991. James Brown versus dozens of artists, record labels, and producers. Hip-hop argued it was art. James argued it was theft without payment. Legal battles consumed years. Courts replaced concerts. The hardest working man in show business now fought judges to prove his genius had value. And the cruel irony was impossible to ignore: every day he spent in courtrooms was a day he wasn't earning money, while the artists who'd sampled his work continued to tour, release albums, and build wealth on foundations he'd laid. Some settlements were reached. A few artists agreed to pay licensing fees retroactively. A handful of record labels acknowledged their obligations and cut checks. But the vast majority of samples remained uncompensated. The legal system moved slowly, hip-hop moved fast, and by the time cases were resolved, new samples had already appeared in new tracks. But the story goes deeper than James Brown alone, because he wasn't the only one being erased from hip-hop's origin story. Behind every James Brown recording were the musicians who'd actually created the sounds being sampled. Clyde Stubblefield, the drummer who played that iconic funky drummer break, never received royalties from any of the thousands of songs that used his rhythm. He wasn't credited on the original recording in a way that entitled him to mechanical royalties, and sampling laws didn't require payment to session musicians, only to songwriters and copyright holders. So while James Brown fought for his share, Clyde Stubblefield, the man whose hands actually struck the drums, received nothing at all. He spent his later years playing small clubs in Madison, Wisconsin, barely scraping by, while his drumming generated hundreds of millions of dollars for others. When journalists found him in the 90s, Clyde admitted it hurt. Others profited millions while he struggled with medical bills. Fred Wesley, James Brown's trombonist, faced the same fate. His horn arrangements appeared in countless samples, but he received nothing. He ended up teaching music while his work made others rich. Everyone benefited except the creators. James, Clyde, Fred, they got legal bills and bitterness. By the late 90s, James's health was failing. Decades of relentless work had destroyed his body. He still performed, but the effort showed. His legendary cape routine now looked like genuine struggle. The sampling never stopped. His sound became invisible, automatic, just another production tool. What hurt James most wasn't even the money, though the financial implications were crushing. What hurt was the disrespect. The erasure. He'd watch awards shows where rappers won trophies for songs built on his breaks. They never mentioned his name. It was as if he'd become invisible, a ghost haunting his own legacy. In 2004, James watched a hip-hop awards show. Young artists dripping in jewelry, celebrating unprecedented wealth built on his back. The host made a joke about sampling, something about how producers were running out of James Brown breaks to use. The audience laughed. James turned off the television and sat in silence for a long time. Later that evening, he called his manager and asked a simple question: "How much money do you think I lost?" His manager knew what he meant, had been tracking the numbers for years. Conservatively? Over $100 million. Maybe more. We'll never know the real number because most samples were never reported. James was quiet again, processing a figure that represented more than money. It represented respect, recognition, the value of a lifetime of innovation. "They built a whole culture on my back," James finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And they left me carrying the weight alone." Understanding what James Brown lost requires understanding what hip-hop became. By the 2000s, hip-hop artists were becoming billionaires. Jay-Z, Dr. Dre building empires on sounds they hadn't created. All built on 60s and 70s samples, mostly James Brown. The mathematics are staggering when you really break them down. Over 7,000 official samples. Tens of thousands if you count underground releases. Each of those songs generated revenue through sales, streaming, radio play, and licensing.
And James Brown's share of that revenue?
A fraction of a percent. Dr. Dre's The Chronic 5 million sold, built on James Brown samples. Nothing But a G-Tang alone sold 2 million.
Standard royalties on that one track? Hundreds of thousands. Across dozens of platinum albums? 100 million wasn't an exaggeration.
But what James Brown really lost was something more valuable: his rightful place as hip-hop's founding father.
Hip-hop history names Kool Herc, Grandmaster Flash, Bambaataa. But the breaks they looped? James Brown. The signature sound? James Brown. The rhythmic foundation, the vocal stylings, the raw energy that defined the genre? All traceable directly back to James Brown's innovations in funk. He didn't influence hip-hop. He made it possible.
But his name got left out of the history books, pushed to the margins, treated as a footnote rather than a founding document.
James had spent his career preaching black economic empowerment: own your masters, control your business.
Then hip-hop did to him what white labels had done for decades.
James Brown died on Christmas Day, 2006, at the age of 73. Heart failure, officially. But he died broken by an industry that took everything and gave scraps.
His final years had been marked by health problems, legal troubles, and financial instability, a humiliating end for a man who'd once been called the hardest working man in show business.
Tributes poured in. Hip-hop legends called him a genius. For a few days, the world remembered.
But even in death, the disrespect continued.
James Brown's estate was immediately thrown into chaos, with multiple parties claiming rights to his wealth and legacy.
His will aimed to fund educational scholarships. But legal battles consumed everything for 15 years. The foundation remained unfunded. Meanwhile, the sampling continued.
James Brown's music kept generating revenue, kept appearing in new tracks, kept building other people's careers.
His death didn't slow the machine down. With James no longer alive to pursue legal action, artists and producers felt even freer to sample his work without compensation. In 2014, a video showed Clyde Stubblefield, 73, playing Funky Drummer at a small club.
Third full. Polite applause. The most sampled rhythm in history, and nobody knew. Nobody rushed the stage to thank him. Nobody acknowledged that they'd just witnessed a living legend playing the most important drum break in hip-hop history. Because in that room, in that moment, Clyde Stubblefield wasn't a legend. He was just an old man playing drums for a few $100s. 3 years later, in 2017, Clyde died from kidney failure. The medical bills from his final years had been crushing, and various musicians had organized benefit concerts to help cover his treatment costs. Think about that. The man who created hip-hop's most sampled rhythm needed charity concerts to afford healthcare while his drumming had generated fortunes for others. 2021, 15 years after his death, the estate settled. His foundation finally began operating. Too late. The billions were long gone. Some of the funds came from licensing deals with streaming platforms, belated acknowledgement that James Brown's catalog had value. But by then, the moment had passed. The culture had already moved on. The settlement was a footnote, barely covered by music press, largely ignored by the hip-hop community that owed him so much. Today, when you listen to hip-hop, you're hearing James Brown whether you know it or not. The rhythmic emphasis on the downbeat, the use of the voice as a percussive instrument, the raw energy and relentless momentum, these are all James Brown innovations, encoded into hip-hop's DNA. Modern producers still sample Funky Drummer, still reach for those same horn stabs and drum breaks, still build tracks on foundations that James laid down 50 years ago. But the royalties still don't flow to his estate in proportion to his contribution. The educational scholarships he envisioned remain underfunded. His name remains marginal in conversations about hip-hop's history. Hip-hop's 2023 50th anniversary was self-congratulatory. Documentaries, exhibitions, triumph narratives. But no one mentioned the unpaid debt. They acknowledged influences in abstract terms, the funk and soul artists who came before us, without naming names or addressing debts.
They celebrated hip hop's achievements without mentioning that many of those achievements rested on unpaid foundations. James Brown's name appeared in some of the retrospectives, usually in montages showing influences on hip hop, his image flashing briefly between other legends. But there was no serious discussion of the economic injustice his story represents. No panels on how to properly compensate sampled artists. No initiatives to establish retroactive payment funds for the session musicians whose work built the genre. The silence was deafening. Real reckoning would mean acknowledgement, restitution, and reformed industry practices. None of this is happening. The 50th anniversary celebrations came and went, and the fundamental injustices remain unaddressed. Let's end with the simplest truth: James Brown gave hip-hop everything, and hip-hop gave him almost nothing in return. For seconds of drumming worth $100 million, and the man who made those 4 seconds possible died struggling financially while others built empires on his foundation. That's the bottom line, the irreducible fact that no amount of posthumous tributes can erase. The godfather of soul became hip-hop's forgotten creditor, honored in words while being robbed in practice. His genius became the commons without his consent, his labor transformed into other people's capital, his legacy reduced to loops and samples that most people can't even trace back to their source. This is the American way with black innovation: celebrate it, appropriate it, profit from it, but never pay full price for it. The story should make us angry. It should make us demand better. It should force uncomfortable conversations about how hip-hop became complicit in the same exploitation it was created to resist. Every time a young producer loads up funky drummer without clearing it, they're making a choice about what kind of culture hip-hop wants to be. Every time a major label settles a sampling lawsuit quietly, they're choosing opacity over accountability. Every time the industry celebrates hip-hop's success without addressing its unpaid debts, they're choosing profit over justice. These choices accumulate, shape norms, determine what future generations will inherit. Right now, we're passing down a culture that treats black genius as freely available raw material, that celebrates influence while refusing compensation. James Brown's story is a mirror that shows hip-hop its own face, brilliant in its creativity and ugly in its economics, revolutionary in rhetoric but conventional in practice. 4 seconds. $100 million. A lifetime of genius reduced to a legal battle he couldn't win. That's not just James Brown's tragedy. It's ours. Because every time we allow this exploitation to continue, every time we consume culture without questioning where the money flows, we become complicit in the theft. His legacy isn't just the music he created. It's the choice he forces us to make, between easy consumption and hard justice, between comfortable ignorance and uncomfortable truth, between celebrating hip-hop's triumph and acknowledging its sins. The beat goes on. Funky drummer keeps looping through speakers around the world. James Brown's voice keeps screaming through samples. The money keeps flowing upward. And somewhere in the silence between beats, you can hear what sounds like a question: when will the debt be paid? When will genius be properly compensated? When will hip-hop finally honor the father it spent 50 years pretending it doesn't know? The answer, so far, is never. But every story told changes what's possible. Every truth spoken makes silence harder. Every time someone learns what happened to James Brown, the culture of exploitation becomes a little less invisible, a little closer to finally ending. Because James Brown deserves better than what he got. And so do all the artists who came after him, who followed his path and inherited his exploitation. Their stories are still being written. The ending hasn't been determined yet. But it starts with remembering what happened, naming what was stolen, and refusing to let the silence continue. 4 seconds. $100 million. A legacy unpaid. Remember those numbers. Let them make you angry. And then ask yourself, what are you going to do about it?